Hello, this is Larry. A number of you guys out there have been aware that I'm building what I call FrankenMachine. I'm actually converting an old pantograph engraver into just a homemade milling machine, or at least that's my hope. Several of you have been asking how it's going, and so I thought I'd just give you a little update on what I'm doing at this point in time. Working currently on building the spindle for the milling head, and I'm trying to do that in a way that I can utilize some of the spare parts and pieces and scrap that I have laying around in my shop. I began by trying, first of all, to build a spindle on something of this basis, utilizing some Timken roller bearings, so that using that type of bearing, of course, can eliminate the axial play when working the machine. Problem I've ran into is that in order to do this and fit the kind of bearings that I need to come up with some thick wall tubing, and I've just not been able to do that so far anywhere locally or in the Tulsa area. There are supposedly a couple of suppliers. I can't get them to answer the phone. So far that's out. I've done a little practice with this. This was just a piece of 1.5-inch black pipe that I've turned, and it would have worked well had it been just a little bit thicker, but so that I could then in here fit my bearings, and then of course put some kind of a shaft through it. The reason this would be the preferred method is I can use a much heavier shaft, which is always good, and being a heavier, thicker shaft, I would then be able to bore and actually a process of reaming a taper for a Morse 2 number 2 type taper in the spindle, that in the end to hold all the tooling. So I'm going to keep looking for the right materials, and that will be a project I'll do later on down the road. In the meantime, I decided to utilize some spare parts that I had laying around. This started off, this was just kind of a practice run while I get to know my little lathe that I picked up last summer, been working on rebuilding. And this was just sort of a concept, just looking to get some ideas in mind, and this started off as a 3/4-inch bolt, and I just left those threads on there. Mostly it was a chance for me to practice using my lathe and learn a few more things on processes, and actually shake a few bugs out on my machine, and discovered some things I needed to repair. So that was the first spindle that I came up with. I decided to make use of an old spindle that I took off of a lawnmower mowing deck, well, I suppose probably about 2 years ago. The old spindle was just in really bad shape. I should have thrown it away, but I can't throw things like that away. I thought, there might be someday I can use that for parts for something else. And so I took that old housing for this old mower deck spindle, chucked it up in the lathe, and I've turned every surface that I thought needed to be trued up. Turned this true, this true, this true, this edge true, turned it this edge, this edge and this edge. Everything is that I thought might have a chance of needing to bolt up to something, and of course everything needed to be trued up anyway to mount it in my lathe and be able to turn the piece accurately. So anyway, that's what I did. And one of the problems I had with this is, of course, I'll be required to run a much smaller diameter shaft than I really want. But one of the things that I do like about it is, after a lot of research, I discovered that the original bearings, of course, were in a mower deck or ball bearings, and that just simply will not do. I need to eliminate all the play that is inherently built into a ball bearing, and to do that I need to run Timken type roller bearings. Finding roller bearings that will work with the current bore sizes of this spindle is difficult to come up with, but I did find, after a lot of research, a set of bearings, roller type bearings, that will be a direct replacement for these old ball bearings. So with that in mind, I then set out to build a spindle to work with those roller bearings in this hub, and that way I can eliminate all the excess play and not have any chatter when the machine is running. This is what I've come up with. This started out as a 7/8 inch diameter by 12-inch long stud. I'm sure everyone knows a stud is basically a bolt with threads on each end. And so that's how it began life. I began to figure out what I thought I needed to do for a roller bearing setup, and so one of the cones the bearings will come in from this end down against this flange, and of course then assembles through this. The other bearing mounts right here, and because they are roller bearings, then the cones are opposing. You can set a preload on them, take out all the play, and I've got everything prepped to do the threading operations a little later on. This land here will be threaded. I've already got the undercut fixed in the shaft for the threading process, as well as the undercut here as I thread this. So there'll be a bearing here, threads, and the nut will then adjust down onto the bearings to take up the slack, and I can adjust the preload on the bearings. The pulley will then mount up here. I will have to machine a slot for a keyway into this, and this will be threaded as well, because being a small diameter shaft, I can't possibly, of course, use a Morse taper, which is preferred, but you know, you just got to do what you got to do. And so I will thread this, and I will build my own tool holders that will screw on to this thread. In addition, I will be able to screw a 5/8 inch drill chuck onto that as well. So that's basically the process and the way it goes together. Of course, let me see if I can do this one-handed. The spindle will have a bearing that rigs up on the land, as I explained a little earlier, just like this. It fits perfectly. So see if I can do this one-handed. So there'll be a Timken bearing. That right now this is just the old ball bearing, but there'll be a roller bearing in its place. It will assemble then into the housing through the other bearing, which is, I've already got it mounted in the end of this housing. It all drops into place, as you can see, and I will be putting a seal in this portion to keep all the chips out of the bearings. And then, as explained earlier, this will be threaded, so the nut, adjustment nut and a jam nut will come down onto this. I'll build a cap or a plate to keep the swarf out of this bearing. So I got set my preload on the bearings there. Then the pulley will rig up on this. I will probably machine this surface on in toward the center so that I will have on the upper arm that supports this, I will have a hole that this will then mount perfectly up through. That hole will then, this shoulder will serve as a pilot into that hole and keep everything tight and lined up well. I went ahead while I was at it and drilled into the end of this shaft while I had it rigged up in the lathe for the proper size, and I'll be tapping some threads in the end of that shaft. And the only reason is I thought I might at some point want to build some special fixtures I can just screw into the end of that spindle, and perhaps for indicators or pointers, or just just a variety of things that come to mind that I might want to utilize that for. So anyway, that's where I'm at so far on the FrankenMachine. Old Frank, I call it. I have to go to work, and I'll be off on the road for the next 4 or 5 weeks, and when I return, I'll get back to work on this project, and when I get this mounted, I'll give you an update for you guys that have been following me on this project. Have a good day.